Hello, everybody, from a stupendously hot and sweaty Brixton in South London, and welcome this afternoon to our session on translating children's books with an extraordinary panel that I feel incredibly privileged to be in the company of, and that I hope will be of great interest and value to all students on the BCLT Summer School 2021. So, today in the room, we have B.J. Epstein, translator, Sawad Hussain, translator from Arabic, Kate Pauwelijn, who is a publisher and a translator from Polish, and Archna Sharma, who is the publisher of Neem Tree Press. I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of them, and you will meet each of them as we go along, and then we'll get cracking with our discussion. And in the course of the discussion, we're going to be covering the process of the publisher and translator relationship and what's made that collaboration special. We're going to look at any challenges they've encountered along the way. We're going to talk a little bit about funding and a little bit about marketing. At a practical level, you are very welcome to contribute to the chat. If you have specific questions that you would like asked and that don't seem to have been covered by our panel, please do put them in the question and answer function, and you can upvote them if something becomes very urgent, and we will look to answer those questions in the final quarter of an hour of our session, so from 2 till 2:15. So I think that's got it covered. I don't want to waste any time with such amazing people on board. So let's get going. I'm going to tell you a tiny bit about B.J. Epstein, and I thoroughly recommend that you look in full at everybody's biogs on the BCLT website, because they are extraordinary biogs. B.J. Epstein is a senior lecturer in literature and translation at the University of East Anglia. Hello, B.J. She's also a writer, editor, breastfeeding consultant, doula, and Swedish to English translator. Her recent translations include The Bird Within Me by Sara Lundberg, inspired by the paintings, letters, and diaries of Swedish artist Berta Hansson, and forthcoming translations include Summer of Diving by Sava Stridsberg, also with illustrations by Sara Lundberg. Next up, we have Sawad Hussain. Sawad is an Arabic translator and literator. Hello, Sawad. Passionate about bringing narratives from the African continent to wider audiences. She was co-editor of the Arabic-English portion of the award-winning Oxford Arabic Dictionary. Her translations have been recognised by English Pen, the Anglo-Omani Society, and the Palestine Book Awards. And she's run workshops introducing translation to students and adults under the auspices of Shadow Heroes, Africa Writes, and the Shubak Festival. Her translation of The Djinn's Apple by Djamila Morani, Algerian historical crime fiction for YA readers with a strong young female lead, will be published by Neem Tree Press in spring 2023, which is why I can't wave the book at you yet. Okay, then we have Kate Pauwelijn. Kate is the Belgian-born founder and director of Book Island, a Bristol-based independent publishing house for picture books in translation. And full disclosure, she's also a publisher who I adore collaborating with, and I also happen to have been Belgian-born. Her purpose is to build bridges between cultures and languages by bringing thought-provoking and beautifully illustrated books from Europe and other parts of the world to English language audiences, young and old. Kate also translates Polish literature into Dutch for Flemish and Dutch publishers, notably Beguni, English translation by Jennifer Croft, Flights, by Olga Tokarczuk, winner of the 2018 Nobel Prize in Literature. And finally, we are joined by Archna Sharma. Hello, Archna. Archna relaunched Neem Tree Press in late 2018 after returning to the UK from many years in the US and Middle East. The press seeks to publish books that broaden and change perspectives. Neem Tree's titles have been showcased at New York City's Smithsonian Design Museum, among others. 2 of their translated YA books by Ahlam Sharat, Codename Butterfly and Trees for the Absentees, have been shortlisted for awards, including the 2020 Safe Gobash Banipal Prize, the Palestine Book Awards, and the Global Literature in Libraries YA Prize. Archna studied medicine, worked in investment banking, and alongside her burgeoning publishing career, also consults for health companies. She had never worked in publishing prior to starting Neem Tree Press. So those are the four extraordinary translator publishers that we're going to be joined by today. And I think you're going to be able to see all of them and hear all of them shortly. And we're going to launch straight into the conversation. And one of the things that, of course, will be at the back of our minds, particularly for the BCLT students watching, is how translating children's literature sits in the practice of these translators, how it works within their broader portfolio. So that'll be the question at the back of their heads. But we're going to start with Neem Tree Press, so with Sawad and Archna. And the question that I've asked the panelists to prepare a little bit here is, what has been your process as publisher translator in introducing this title into English? So in the case of Neem Tree, we're talking about The Djinn's Apple by Djamila Morani. And over to both of you about your process.
Okay, well, thank you for having us here today. We both are really excited to take part in this panel, and we're delighted, when we were invited. So I thought I'd talk about perhaps first how I came across the novel, The Djinn's Apple, which in Arabic is Tufah al-Djinn. And I came across it first on the Arab Lit blog. There's an Algerian literary critic called Nadia Ghanem, and she wrote about how this book was underappreciated and wasn't getting, the sort of attention that it should. And after I read her post, I contacted her immediately on Twitter and I said, can you put me in contact with the author, please? And she was really generous and gave me the author's details. And then, after I read the book, which you've already kindly, described, it just gripped me, the sort of fast-paced whodunit aspect about it, the gutsy 12-year-old protagonist, Nardine, who, I'm not giving anything away here, it's in the opening pages, sees her family like murdered before her eyes and spends the rest of the novel finding out why this happened and who did it. And what really drew me to the book itself is that it's a historical crime fiction YA novel, and it's set in the Abbasid period, which is 700 to 800 AD, somewhere in the Middle East, which isn't specified, where it is. And so while you're following her on this journey of what starts out as revenge, I won't tell you how it ends up, but you're also getting to see, how life was at that time. And what I found particularly exciting is that she's flouting all of society's expectations for her, and so after I was able to confirm with the author that the rights were available and that she was happy for me to translate it into English, I then contacted Archna because we have a great relationship and I just hadn't had a book to really, I think we had discussed a few other titles before, but they weren't really up her alley. And I was like, maybe let me try this one because I know that she is a great supporter of YA and translation. And there aren't many, there's Pushkin Press and, Penguin, which does do YA and translation. But to be honest, how do you get to even speak to those publishers, right? You can't, who am I and who are they? And having known Archna for so many years, I really thought that she would connect with this narrative, and she did. And so I'm going to pass it over to her now because I'm just conscious of the time.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's so helpful to hear you describing that journey from you being a scout, essentially, to investigating the right situation, to approaching the publisher. Really helpful to have that clearly outlined. Thank you. Archna.
So thank you for having me. It's great to be on this panel. So basically I made the decision pretty quickly. So because I'm such a small press, essentially I end up making decisions. I don't really need to talk to many other people about it. And I had known Sawad for a very long time. We're part of this network where, we're all sort of connected with Arabic translators. And so it was fabulous. And I just thought it ticks all the boxes that Neem Tree Press wants. And you really are putting a lot of trust in the translator, because although I have fledgling knowledge of Arabic, I can't read the book to assess it. So I'm relying on the translator to tell me this is a great book, this is why it'll fit in your list. And I think in terms of introducing this title to the English language, obviously the title will get published in 2023. So we haven't done it yet, but we've done a couple of things. So because we got the Pen Translation Award, we did a press release immediately for that. So then automatically it's in people's sort of sphere. We're doing this panel, which is actually fantastic to talk about the book. We also have it in our rights catalog, and we're going to go out and actively start marketing for translation rights, etc. Right now, so even well before a publication date. And then the rest of it, we will, I guess, do exactly how we treat any other book, which is you come up with a fabulous cover design, you do a fun book trailer, and then we'd look at any and all marketing aspects that we can pull out from any book. And this one has quite a few. So it has a YA element, it has a historical fiction element, it has a historical fantasy element, and of course it has a book and translation element. So you prize those specific marketing trends, and you would pick out the best reviewers, the best presses, or the best podcasters, the best influencers, and pick out who would be the best to approach. And we would hope, and particularly since we have so much time now, we would approach reviewers well in advance. So this book will be ready to go and in reviewers' hands well before publication date. We will book, in magazines, whatever we can, and we would possibly do competitions. So, for example, Topster does great children's competitions, and we will get it in kids' hands, early. And we would put it on NetGalley, and on the whole social media front, we would end up, or we are already developing sort of a steady marketing campaign that would ramp up information about the book and try and engage readers before publication. So we are a very small press, but one thing that we're realizing is the longer the visibility for any book, the better it is. And, in the beginning, when you start a press, you're kind of scrambling because you're kind of learning on the go. So Sarah, as you know, I hadn't really done publishing quite a bit. So you kind of learn things on the go. But I think now we're in a pretty good place where we are madly trying to acquire books, and we have a pretty good sense of how to market books in the future. But I think it's really picking out and then if you can get the author, and there's lots of issues, which I think we'll talk about later, about where authors live and how you get them. But of course, if we can set up a book tour and market it to schools and have Djamila here with Sawad, that would be fantastic.
Yes, that's the holy grail down the line, isn't it? Oh, wow, you've covered so much there, Archna. And so interesting what you were saying about trust, this placing your trust in the translator, in the same way that I think you might reference later on that the person who designs the cover might have to do that based on a sample translation, not having seen the whole translation and not reading Arabic. So that element of trust, Pen translates, and the impact of that on funding, something that we can discuss later, and which was awarded to the Djinn's Apple. And this sense of small being beautiful, but very powerful, punching well above your weight if you're nimble, and if you have that sense of the crossover audiences, and that actually all those different categories what do I want to say, have this cumulative effect that can actually give you so much more traction. So with all that in mind, please can we now be joined by Greet and BJ, who are going to talk about translating their book from the Swedish, and which is based on the real letters and artworks. And there is the original, which BJ has there. Fantastic. So it would be wonderful to hear how this came about in its genesis and the process.
Thank you very much for having us today on this panel, and congratulations to Sawad and Archna for winning the Pen Award. So let me maybe tell you about the journey of The Bird Within Me, which started in 2018, so a long time ago, and it shows how much lead-up time you need to publish a successful book. So in 2018, in May, I decided to apply for subsidies from the European Union because I realized that it might be our last chance. And So we had very little time. We had like 1 month. And I kind of knew what I was looking for. I'm always looking for books that are beautiful and meaningful at the same time from abroad, which is very difficult to find. I have this wonderful resource called Depictus, which is a small online platform for independent publishers. And we all share our new books in the original language, and then we can browse books from our friends from around the world and see whether they're suitable for us. So this is how I found out about The Bird Within Me in the Swedish original. I don't speak Swedish. I'm Dutch speaking, so I have a little understanding of it. We have a lot of false friends between Dutch and Swedish, so I have to be a bit careful. So when we decided to go ahead with the submission, I immediately went for this book. I knew it existed also from Bologna. I had been catching up with the agent of Sara Lundberg. So she had shown me the book. I had seen it in the flesh in the original Swedish edition. I saw it in Depictus, and then I knew it had won multiple awards, which is very useful. It reduces the risk. Just like Archna, I'm a very small publisher. Book Island is just me. So I have to be very careful with how I invest my money. And knowing that a book has won awards, that it has been translated into many other languages, it's just gives me the confidence to go ahead. Now, I had one little problem. I didn't know any translators from Swedish, so I had to ask around. And I'm very fortunate to be working with Sara, who knows so many other literary translators. And I've also worked with Laura Watkinson and David Colmer and Tonya Lloyd-Jones, and they all recommended BJ. So I emailed BJ, and maybe BJ, you can tell us what happened next after I emailed you, and when I asked you to write a report to assess the book.
So I got your email, and I was actually on sick leave from work. I was pregnant and very ill with my pregnancy. But I saw your email, and I thought, oh, I'm so sick. I'm lying in bed, but this sounds amazing. I need to see this book. And so despite being ill, got up, wrote you back, I think the same day even. And I got the book and wrote a report on it. And I thought, I'm very ill, but whoever is going to translate it, you need to do this book because it is so beautiful. And Great was saying that she was looking for books that were beautiful and meaningful. And this really filled the brief. I felt that it was a book that really spoke to anybody, regardless of their circumstances, their life situation. There was something in there that we could all relate to. So I wrote that report, and you applied for funding and got funding. And then I had my baby, my second child, and I was doing the translation with the baby in the sling on me because it was a pretty short period of time that we had. So I had this, just weeks old baby, and sent you, I think, the first draft when she was probably about 2 months old. And so that's how we were working on it. And then we had, a couple of drafts back and forth discussing some of the challenges, which we'll talk about later, I think. And it was just a wonderful book to work on. I was really lucky.
What a story, what a genesis.
Yeah, so to speak. Yes, definitely.
Yes, I think what was really special for me was that we both shared a passion for the book. We both immediately fell in love with it. And when I received your translation, I was even more in love with it. I just thought, yes, this is going to be amazing. And even if it's not successful in the UK, this is just a book for me. But it went on to be very, very successful. And it was shortlisted for the Kate Greenaway Award with this year. And we've had wonderful feedback from the shadowers, from librarians. It's been a wonderful journey.
Oh. Wow. So that takes us straight into this idea of the closeness of the collaboration. And I suppose with Greet and BJ, that for you, BJ, as well, is about working with the illustrations. So I'm going to park that idea to germinate with you, but it'll be interesting to hear what it was like, not just translating a text, but translating a text that is so driven by those exquisite and evocative illustrations. And you raised the point as well of the relatability, that central struggle in this book of artistic talent versus family commitments, I suppose, put simply. So that's something to pick up on. So if we could return to Sawad and Archna and hear a little bit more about how your collaboration, which is very ongoing. I mean, we're in the long haul here. It's not going to see the light of day in terms of the big wide world until spring 2023. So some of this is projection, some of this collaboration is all to be discovered, right? But what can you tell us about it so far, and of your expectations of it, and to what extent you've already talked about being networked, having shared values, and the fact that trust is there, what a difference that makes to your working relationship.
Okay, Archna, do you want to go? Or sure.
Well, I can go. Yeah. So Sawad and I have known each other for a very long time.
Yeah, I don't even know how long.
I think so we met on email, years ago. And then we actually met in person at London Book Fair, the Translators Centre. And I think Daniel Han was, the speaker there, or he was organising it. And Sawad and I were in the audience, and we kind of started chatting as one does. And she was living in Cambridge, and I think Cambridge, and so we talked about that. And then, of course, I was super impressed by the fact that she had contributed to the Oxford Arabic English Dictionary. And I have two boys, and we were in the Middle East at the time, so they were learning Arabic at school, and they actually ended up, continuing with Arabic. And so for me, that was also a very personal sort of interest in Sawad. And then we just clicked, and we knew each other, and we sort of kept in touch. And then she approached me, as she said, actually, for a few books, and the others didn't quite click for one reason or another. And this one just did. And I've had to go through her every time I wanted to get in touch with Djamila. So Djamila doesn't speak English, right? So, and my French is, it's okay, but it's broken. So I have to go to, so actually, every time I want to talk to the author, I have to email Sawad, which is fantastic because we're hardly ever not in touch. So even though the book won't be ready until September, or when published in 2023, we are forever going to be contacting each other. And actually, we had a great conversation yesterday with this panel, and have made even more connections that is going to lead, US connections and stuff. So it's really just an ongoing relationship. And I'm sure there'll be another book to do. She suggested another translator for another book that I'm looking at. So it's fabulous. I mean, she's a friend. What can I say? It's just great. I love spending time with her.
Oh my God.
And actually, the other thing is, I have a brother-in-law who's Ghanaian, and her husband is Ghanaian, which makes it more interesting.
Which is really, I was like, what? That was a real coincidence. Yeah, because I was in Ghana anyway, sorry,
layers
Sarah.
and layers of interconnectedness and meshedness. Presumably that's very interesting for Djamila as well. She must feel very supported as the author here if she's constantly being approached by Sawad on behalf of Archna. She's got a sense of just how much of an investment Neem Tree Press is making, and that makes a difference for her, presumably, being on her journey to being born into English, as it were.
Yes, I would hope so. I think, but it's not unusual in that, like, I would say, with the exception of one author, I haven't worked with about 13 authors, for book length things. It's always me who has to be the go-between, even if they are comfortable, understanding English or can read a little bit. In terms of when it comes to communication, it's much quicker for them to just tell me in Arabic, well, tell the publisher this, or etc. And so for most of my authors, we communicate via WhatsApp and voice notes. But I don't think I'm at that stage with Djamila yet. It takes some time to get them comfortable enough. And I think we'll get there once I start translating the text. Although having said that, I didn't really have many questions when I was doing the sample, which is, unusual for me because usually I have so many questions. And in terms of my relationship with Archna, I think when we were discussing this yesterday, I was trying to figure out, aside from the sort of shared life experiences that we've had and mutual admiration of one another, is that I realized that I feel, and this might be like getting a bit personal, but hey, we're here. So that I don't have to perform for her in that, like when I'm talking to her as a publisher, sometimes with other publishers or editors, I always have to be like, on. But with Archna, it's like we can just have a chat and spit ideas back and forth at one another. And if one of them falls flat, it's okay. Like she's not going to, not want to hear my ideas in the future or something. And so that's what I think helps us come up with such great, just, plans. Yeah. And I think something we'll address later in the panel is why it's not coming out until 2023. And Archna can talk about the challenges with that. Is because I also had a kid and in the middle of the pandemic, it's like baby boom. And as a result, a lot of my projects got pushed back. And so that's why I'm not able to translate this book until, next year.
That sounds like a positively valid excuse, Sawad.
Yeah.
But so interesting hearing about the way that you don't feel you have to be too performative with Archna, that there's that sort of organic space where ideas and exchange and dialogue can happen. And out of that, perhaps grow things that neither of you are expecting, rather than having to put the signed and sealed deal on the desk. So that's interesting, that nurturing environment, isn't it? Yeah. And so babies seem to be a bit of a theme, because with BJ, we had the end of Europe as we knew it in terms of our relationship to it, or the end of the UK's culturally funded involvement in Europe on the one hand, and the beginning of a new life in BJ's family on the other. But if we can find out a bit more about the nitty-gritty of your collaboration and this question about how much you've translated illustrated books before, for example, BJ, and what it felt like translating them in this context, and what it was like for Greet working from a language that you hadn't worked from before, Greet. I mean, you're a polyglot, but Swedish isn't one of the languages that you have.
So yeah, maybe should I start a little bit? Yeah. I mean, one of the things that was great about working with Greet is because, as you said, Sarah, already, she's also a translator herself. And so she really understands what it is that we're doing as we're translating. And obviously she's an expert on picture books. And so I never felt that she was coming in and saying, this is what you must do, or this is just wrong, or these ideas are silly. It was always, in preparation for this panel, I was looking through our emails and through the different drafts that we went through with the book, and her suggestions were always so sort of polite and, do you think this might work better, or have you thought about it this way? And it was so much about collaboration together, and I felt that she really understood the book, and she also really understood what I was doing as a translator, and so yeah, for me it was a wonderful collaboration. Hopefully Greet feels the same way, and yeah, do you want to say something about that?
Well, I've learned to write those suggestions in a nice way from my editors, because I'm always amazed at how they do it. I suggest to perhaps maybe, and they're saying, I want you to change this. This is wrong. But they say it in such a nice, kind way that you think, yes, of course we're going to do that. So I've actually learned that.
Well, that worked well. I think it worked
Seems to be working.
Yeah, and I think, there weren't huge numbers of things that we needed to discuss, but it was a very sort of open discussion. And same with the editor, Vicky, who was looking at
Mila. Yes, she's great. She's very British, very very polite. When I remember translating Bieguni, Olga Tokarczuk's book, into Dutch, and I received my first draft from the Dutch editor, and it was just all crossed out, no suggestions. It was just, no, this is what it's going to be. You accept it or you don't. It's a completely different approach, and I quite like the British way of doing it.
You were asking about about the illustrations.
Yes.
As well. And then I can just hold up. I'm just randomly flipping through it, but it's really interesting. I randomly opened to this page because so many pictures, so many illustrations in this book have hands in them. And I would really say that the book in a lot of ways is about hands. So it's about creating things with your hands, it's about artistry, it's about touching people, having that human connection, which is very interesting given the times that we're living in. The main character, Berta, who was a real person, her mother had tuberculosis and they weren't allowed to touch one another for fear of infection. And so she could see her mother across the room and would want to touch her and couldn't. And there was all this kind of longing and the sense of of touch and using hands, and that was kind of in the pictures, but it was also in the words, and so it was a matter of kind of finding the right word choices, if possible, to bring that learning across. Sometimes you feel, I'll see if I can find one of the other, here's another one with hands, you can see, that her father sitting in church, the father with his hands crossed, he was against her being an artist, and there she is wanting to do things with her hands all the time, and it's so beautiful. But when you're translating an illustrated book, there's sometimes choices that you have to make. Am I going to prioritize the words, or am I going to prioritize the images? Sometimes, yes, that's one of the ones I was thinking of. I almost feel like they're your hands. Yes, and so it was really about trying to kind of decide what to prioritize, and when possible, trying to prioritize both the words and the images.
Okay.
Just one last one.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Beautiful.
And so important, I think, what you've both hinted, which is that the editing process teaches us so much as translators, doesn't it? And we can wear either hat. Sometimes we're more the editor, sometimes we're more the translator, in your case, Greet. And but that learning that we do in the editing process, and Sawad, it sounds as if in a way you're bringing so much to Archna's table with all your scouting and acquire, looking to acquire and so on. And then it will be very interesting how that pans out in the editing process. Will this be the first title that you've had edited by Neem?
Yes, yeah, it will definitely be the first title that I've had, and actually something which we haven't done, but I don't know, maybe now that we're talking about it, I could ask Archna if it's okay. That for other books I've done is that I've had the editor edit the sample, so I can see what their style of editing is. And this is for books I've pitched where the publisher has accepted it, and I've just said, okay, so going forward, just so I know what you're focusing on as an editor, what your priorities are, could you edit my sample? And that's been really helpful, actually. Just so, from minor things like house style, if I can pick up on a few things, I'll save the editor time down the road, as well as, maybe there's a particular way they want something expressed. So yeah, actually, maybe we should do that.
Actually, that's I think that's a great idea. And the sample that we're dealing with is a fantastic sample. And I think that's a fantastic idea, actually, because it does mean that when you're going to translate the rest of it, you have a sense of a style or twist or language or whatever that might help. So okay, I'm on for this.
Thanks. We'll get it putting best practice into action live.
And
I would thoroughly endorse that. I've recently been working on a new book by Faiz again, and it was put in for some funding, and a stipulation of the funding is that the sample is copy edited, and that was so fantastic. Really early in the process for myself and the editor to collaborate there and to set out the way that we want to work on it, and it really sets the bar as high as you want it to go for the rest of the translation. Great things happening live in the panel session. We like that. Okay, so now it would be good to hear about some of the challenges. So here we all are working as small, nimble and beautiful independent publishers. And with that potentially come greater risks, as Greet has alluded to, and greater challenges. So I'm going to put that out to all of you. Let's break with the ping pong approach now. It's more open. And just talking about some of the challenges that you've encountered, particularly on these two titles working together, or as relevant, other challenges that you'd like to throw into the mix.
Well, I'm fine with starting because there's lots of challenges. So one of the challenges has been, and I've run this by Sawad, so she's fine with me referring to it.
Totally
fine. One of the challenges is timing. So as a publisher, I would have initially liked to have published this in 2022. And actually the Penn grant kind of would have, but it's okay, they're fine with doing it in spring 2023. So having it done at the right time, but I absolutely appreciate timing issues from Sawad's side. So timing's been one of them. The other one is we sort of went down the path of, and I think Sarah, you talked about this, of commissioning a cover design from a fabulous cover designer. And he came up with some amazing covers, but they just didn't work for various reasons. And so now we're going to go out and we're debating, actually. So that was one of the things that we brainstormed yesterday. Maybe we'll do it, send it out and try and find young designers and send it out as a competition, and see whether we can find someone with a particular design that we're looking for. But I think, again, it's sending it to someone with a sample translation who doesn't speak Arabic, particularly if it's historical fiction. So we have a creative design brief, which we think is very detailed and very informative. So hopefully that'll be sufficient to get. So that's been one of the things. And I think one of the other very practical challenges, and I found this with Ahlan Basharat, who lives in the West Bank, Palestine, is getting visas to come here. Both just practical visas. I mean, many authors that I would love to translate don't have passports of convenience. They don't live in countries where they can just hop over, and that actually is and they don't speak English. So if you have all of those three, it certainly makes things a bit more difficult from a marketing perspective and a logistical perspective. So those are the major things. And I don't know what visa issues are like from Algeria. We will just, figure that one out. But that's very, very practical. And we certainly, with Ahlan, oh my God, she was stuck in Jordan for the longest time. We didn't know whether she was going to be able to come for the Palestine Book Awards. There were lots and lots of issues there. So it becomes very, I think in a lot of the Arab-speaking world, that is a major issue. So.
And yet you still decide to publish these books. I mean, I must still just applaud you for that, because that's an excuse a lot of publishers use. Like, oh, they don't speak English. Oh, they can't come over. Oh, the marketing team is not happy with that. I've had that before, that all of these combined, unfortunately, and I understand it will impact the distribution of the book. But even so, why is it falling upon the smaller publishers to take these risks? I'm just going to leave that there.
Out of interest, we have quite an interesting question in here you might like to address at the moment, which is saying that The Tree Within, of course, has the same as the original cover because the illustrations are absolutely integral. They are 50% of the book. But the question is, why does the Djinn's Apple need a different cover?
Okay. I just and I think, Sawad, you probably don't like the original cover. It will not work. This is crime historical fantasy fiction. It needs to drip with blood, gore, and all these emotions, and that cover just didn't. So I think there are some covers. So actually, with Ahlan, for example, we published not only the English translation, but we actually edited the original Arabic and published the Arabic, and we used the same cover. But of course, because it's Arabic, we had to make sure that the cover, because this is not a European language, it's Arabic, it works the other way. So the cover has to work, both ways, because text. So there's issues with languages that don't read in the same direction as English does. But I think at the end of the day, you're looking for, that's why there are certain covers that are different even in the UK market versus the US market. So I think it's very much dependent on the book and the cover, and we just didn't feel that the Arabic cover works. Doesn't work for us. I think it'll work for the audience. It's
the sensibilities of the market. I think it's what would have worked, for that particular market. We don't think it will be as engaging for YA readers in this English language market.
Oh, thank you for answering that, and really helpful, Sawad, to have you with your salutary reminder that that we are publishing in spite of all these challenges and these visa challenges, and that there are many allies out there in terms of English Pen and the festivals who do so much work to try and enable that international exchange of ideas and to try and program those books and those writers in any event. So Greet and BJ, would you like to tell us a little bit more about some of the challenges that you encounter in your particular collaboration and beyond?
I think that we experienced a few practical issues with the translation itself, and one of the big things we spent time discussing was the school system, because this book takes place over 100 years ago, and the school system in Sweden has changed since then, and it's of course different from here. So it was just kind of referencing the school system and how do we explain that without giving too much explanation, so it's no longer sort of has the literary feel. So that was kind of a practical discussion we had. But I think a larger thing that I wondered about and worried about was that it's quite an unusual book. I'm just holding this out. You can see there's quite a big book. So I think it's 128 pages, great. And that it's a little confusing to people. So it's not a picture book for the smallest of children. It's not a graphic novel for, young adults and adults. It's something that kind of can be read to young readers, can be read alone by middle grade readers. It can be read by anybody. But I was worried that people were going to be confused by it and not know where to put it in the bookstore or in the library, or not know how to sort of perceive it. Who is this for? So that was something that I was thinking about. In the end, it's done really well, as we can attest to. But it's just very unusual for what it is, and they're absolutely beautiful.
There's some trepidation and anxiety about the readership and its unusual scope, but that seems to have been overcome in terms of reception in the English-speaking world, Reed.
Yeah. But that's, I think, thanks to the Kate Greenaway nomination and then long list and then shortlist. I think we should be very grateful to Philip and all the librarians who nominated the book. So with this kind of book, which Sara Lundberg actually called a picture novel, and we have to think of the booksellers because they can be quite traditional and they think in board books, big books, and chapter books. They have three categories. But where do you put this? Is this for, what is the age range? What is the recommended age for this book? Yeah.
So can I ask you a very practical question, Greet? Where does it go in the bookshop? As far as the booksellers were concerned, where were they putting it?
Well, they were putting it with picture books. Because it's not really a chapter book. And I think some of them have shelves that says sophisticated picture books. And that's where it would go. In the library, it goes on sophisticated picture bookshelves, and also because of the theme of loss and grief, it can also go on in that area. But what is so wonderful about it is that it can be read by so many different people of so many different ages, between the age of 6 and 99. Sarah actually told us that in Sweden, she was mainly approached by elderly women who recognize themselves in the story because it's set in the early 1900s in one of the most remote parts of Sweden, in the north. It's about a little girl who grows up on a farm. She wants to be an artist and doesn't see her future on the farm, but it's very difficult for her to find her path to get out of there. She eventually manages to leave and go to an art school and then become a teacher. And lots of women just recognize themselves in that story. And even I did. I grew up in Belgium, not even on a farm, but I thought it was about me because I felt very misunderstood during my childhood. I was obsessed with reading. I wasn't allowed to read. I always got punished for reading. She then, I think we can say that Berta, the protagonist, she got punished for writing, for making art and drawing. She was being told off for that. So I really saw myself in that. And BJ, you saw yourself in there as well, didn't you?
Absolutely, yeah.
So we've been. What I really love about this book is that it's turned out to be much more valuable and much more layered than I expected it to be. Even after we had translated it, once the teachers and reviewers started picking at it and taking it apart and looking at it from their angle, we realized there was so much more to it. Like, BJ, remember how you were preparing this webinar for the students at university, and you start focusing on the hands. Well, you didn't start focusing, and you knew about them. Well, that's a very interesting angle that I hadn't noticed at all. So I love that when the book is taken away from me and people start reading it and they see their own stories in it and they have their own perspective. So it's been a true gem for Book Island.
What's so fascinating and that's emerging in all of these discussions is that what can appear to be very niche and at risk of being marginalized, in fact, has so many different intersectional, if you like, audiences. And that when you bring that together, you have a book that has very great appeal, but that if prejudged, might never get past the first hurdle. And that's so interesting in relation to books in translation, and particularly children's books in translation. And I wonder if that segues us into discussing funding and marketing a little bit, and looking at those more practical aspects.
I just wanted to say something about that. So I've been publishing for 10 years now, nearly 10 years, and I've misjudged the books I've acquired quite a few times, where I thought, oh, this is a book for toddlers, early readers, only for early readers. And then it turns out that 7, 8, 9-year-olds really love it too. Or that it also appeals to adults, which is great, because then we have this audience that suddenly multiplies, and then you have teachers who share it with the students in their class, and that's what I want. I want our books to be shared with as many readers as possible, young and old.
Thank you. I think we've temporarily lost BJ. I imagine she might be rebooting. I think she was experiencing some microphone difficulties. So we'll continue the conversation and hope that she can join us as soon as possible. So yes, if we can continue this talking about the reach and the marketing and the funding, that would be very helpful.
Yes. So with regards to funding, I mean, we had identified early on that we need to apply for funding. And so we applied for an English pen grant. And I think, I'm not sure, for a number of years, I've been an English pen grant assessor, right? So I've been on the other side assessing Arabic titles from, I can't remember how long I've been doing it. So this was, I think, second or perhaps third grant I had applied for. And so it was a very collaborative process in filling out the application. I think sometimes some translators might expect the publisher to do the entire application, which might happen in some cases. But for a number of the applications I filled out, I've had like a very integral role in adding in sections and giving feedback, etc. But I'll pass it on to Archna.
Yeah, so this was the first pen translate grant that we'd applied for. Actually, this was the first translation grant we had applied for, and I only did it because Sawad knew exactly what she was doing. So once you've gone through the process and actually had someone hold your hand, you realize, oh, it's not that intimidating. But I have to say that I wouldn't have embarked on it if I didn't have her there. And then we went on to apply for another grant for a Romanian novel and got that also. So we're now on a roll. And we're going to apply for lots of grants. But I have to say that it helped. It helped a lot to have the one, but also to actually go through the grant process. So it forced me into a marketing mode. As a very young publisher, you kind of like a book, you're like, yeah, it's great. But actually, what the process did was it forced me to tease out all the marketing avenues that we were going to do, and exactly why this book needed to be translated and should get translated, and who would read it, and where would they read it, and who could we get to talk about it. So I think I would say that obviously we all want grant applications to be successful, but I reckon that even going through the process itself early on is incredibly helpful. But having Sawad there was, it was really, really helpful. And it was fantastic when we got it. And I have to say with Pen English, the whole process was extremely smooth. It was all done online. Responses were so quick. And within weeks of knowing that we got it, the money was in the bank. And, I could send it up to, so it all went incredibly smoothly. And it really makes me feel, we'd love to use that grant process again. Very friendly.
And excellent to hear, Archna, that because particularly with Pen Translates, there is an emphasis on the strength of the project and the strength of how you will market it, in addition to the original strengths of the original work. Really helpful to hear that focused your mind in that way and played a positive role in strategizing as a publisher. Yeah, and also I think I really appreciate the marketing clout
that getting that grant brings. So it's not just the fact that the translation is funded, and because we're so small, the translation is actually 100% funded, which is great for us. But really, even the greater value is the marketing clout, and I think that they will be, incredibly helpful. And for us, I'm really, really looking forward to getting the book out. Absolutely.
Terrific. And we do have a couple of questions in here that sort of sit quite well. One about whether anybody would like to add something about the specific challenges attached to acquiring publishing rights. So a question there. And another from Sander, who is asking, would like to hear more about the Romanian novel. There is a little bit about it, Sander, in Archna's biography on the BCLT website, but perhaps there'll be time for that as well. Did anyone want to speak to challenges associated with acquiring publishing rights?
I'm happy to say a few words about it. Because I don't have distribution in the US, I often get outbid by American publishers. That's my main challenge, where I fall in love with a book. And when I inquire whether the rights are still available, the rights agent or the publisher will say, well, yes, from a North American publisher, and they want world rights. So then I miss out. Another problem is that I often acquire rights to books that are very obscure, I'd say. No one has heard of them. I only get the rights excluding North America. And a year later, a North American publisher will acquire the rights for the book that I published first. And then through Amazon, they'll start infiltrating the UK market. Those books will start coming into the market because I refuse to supply Amazon. So that's really, really tricky. That's probably my biggest challenge, and I don't know how to stop that. I'm now thinking about asking publishers to add a clause to the contract saying that they're not allowed to sell the rights to publishers that work with Amazon, because even though they try to stop them, they can't. It's impossible because they don't care about borders and territories.
Yeah.
Maybe this is a bit complicated for the students who are listening in now, but the English language market is divided in territories, and you can buy the world rights, or you can say, actually, I only need North American rights because we don't have a distribution partner in the rest of the world. And that used to be fine until Amazon came along and started shipping all around the world, dishonoring the contracts.
So we need some female names for David and Goliath, I'm thinking here, don't we, in terms of what we're taking on as protagonists.
So I would say I totally am on the same page with Greece. So perhaps because we are so young, I basically have said, unless you give me world rights, I'm not interested. Period, stop. It's not even negotiable for me. And if you're saying that you want to take, and I know that we will only get sent books that, if I'm being really blunt, that no other larger publisher has accepted, right? So they're coming to me as a really small publisher. So I'm like, okay, so if you want me to publish your book, I think it's a fabulous book, then you've got to give me world rights. And if you're not interested, then let's move on. So for me, it's that is something that is so core that I cannot negotiate out of world rights. So, yeah.
But do you distribute in North America?
We do have distribution in North America. We do. But, again, it's a kind of tough one. So if you acquire world rights, do you then try and sell the North American rights to another publisher? And we're exploring that, whether we can come up with a relationship there. Because what happens is it's not just distribution, it's the marketing and PR costs. And also to have somebody on the ground. So I'm beginning to get a pretty good feel of the UK market, particularly for children's books. I kind of know what that now, and the other issue is specialist PR. So now we have a specialist, children's PR person on board that we work with. And that for me is key. So there are certain avenues that a generalist PR person just doesn't know, school competitions, getting out to libraries, etc. And we don't have someone like that in the US yet. So although we have, Kate Greenaway's got great distribution in the US, it still means that it's not as effective because the marketing and PR is not as effective, and that's that's from us. So I think it's but we're exploring things, and by the time the Djinn apple comes out, we'll be all set. So, it's really interesting. I think the whole marketing PR stuff is to find the right return on investment as a publisher. You can spend a lot of money on outside PR and inside PR, etc. And for us, we don't have sufficient data to figure out what works and what doesn't as yet. So we're learning every day. So it's an ongoing, but that's why it's great.
So watch this space. We need another panel in 2023 to find out what you've learned on that journey, Archna. If we go with this idea of investment, let's take it back to the original artisanal investment that in this case comes from BJ and comes from Sawad. And before we open to the floor, if we could, I'd love just to hear a little bit from you about what translating books, either for YA in the case of Sawad, or in the case of what we're calling a picture novel in the case of BJ, what that has meant for your practice and how that differs, say, from translating for grown-ups, and where it sits for you. And in relation to that, we have some questions in from Beverly, who is asking about the fact that in translating picture books, her students limit the vocabulary because it's for children. Do you find these books for all ages are liberating and open up your choices, I guess, with respect to vocab? And could you talk a little bit about how the images impact your translation choices? So this artisanal journey, going back to the investment of the translator. So who would like to start there?
I think we should start with BJ because I'm interested to hear her response to Beverly's question actually about the images.
I don't think. Is it working now?
Yeah, it's working.
Oh, finally. I've tried so many things, so sorry about that. But I'm here. So I definitely don't believe in limiting vocabulary for children, or my view is that, children live in the world and they have a right to know about any topic and to hear all sorts of language. Many people are very concerned about taboos or about appropriateness, and I tried to not think about those things. I was telling Greet the story a couple of weeks ago about how a book that I have that's coming out next year that I translated, the publisher in the US got very angry because I used the word poo. And many of us who have children, or indeed have been children, we know that that's something that children are very interested in and like talking about. But the publisher was going, no, we simply can't. I think they were worried about what was going to upset parents, and they didn't want parents complaining, oh, now my child's going to use that word. So they made me change it to something stinky rather than using the word poo. So I wasn't so pleased with that. So my view personally, as a parent, as a translator, is that, you have a book, it can talk about anything, talk about it in all sorts of ways, and you translate it thinking about your target audience, but never underestimating them, because people so often underestimate children and think children can't handle this or don't understand that. Children are so bright and they're so open to things, so curious, and they have the right to be exposed to all sorts of things through literature. The second bit that I think you asked about was about how the images impact your translation choices. And yeah, you cannot separate the words from the images. Sometimes I feel you look at a picture book and the words tell one story, the images tell another story, and then they come together and tell this kind of third thing. And so you have to integrate them. And of course, there's sometimes when you have to prioritize one over the other simply because of the way language works. But in general, I always try to look at what's there. I mean, we've already talked about the kind of importance of hands and touch in this book. So I was always thinking about ways of getting that feeling across, that sense of longing, that sense of wanting to touch, wanting to create things. And you can't ignore them. People always look at picture books and go, oh, well, it must be easy. It's just a few words, but it's not. It's really difficult because you've got both things to focus on.
Always beware the just word. If there's just in there, it's way more difficult than anyone thinks, right?
I mean, a book that I translated that just came out a couple of weeks ago, it had all this wordplay in there, which is great fun. But one of the bits of wordplay was a crocodile, and it had to do with changing out certain letters with the crocodile, and there was a picture of a crocodile. I couldn't get that to work in English. But in my mind, crocodiles and alligators look very similar. So in that case, I just changed it to an alligator. And I think that sometimes you do have to make those kinds of changes. And hopefully nobody will write in and tell me that, one of them has a slightly more, flat nose or whatever the exact difference is.
Sawad is keen to hear the title of this book that you've just translated on alligator.
And the poo one. And
the book with the alligator crocodile change is the book that did not want to be read. It's by a Swedish comedian called David Sundin, I guess. And the one that with the poo in it is The Summer of Diving. Greet mentioned that before, actually. And so, or I think Sarah mentioned it, sorry. And it has illustrations as well by Sara Lundberg, but it's written by Sarah Ardizzone, and that will be out next year. So yeah, sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
Could you tell us about, this deep sort of distillation process that you go into when you're talking about prioritizing between words and pictures? What's the impact of that on your practice when you are translating a text for grown-ups? How does it filter back to your other translation processes?
I don't know if this will sound a little bit strange, but I always kind of imagine myself as, an actor, and I'm playing the role of the characters or the author or whatever might be appropriate for the given book. And so in this case, I was imagining myself as both Sara Lundberg and also, Berta Hansen, the character, the person that it's about. And so trying to imagine how they felt about the images, how they felt about the stories, what they were trying to get across. I love the expression performing without a stage, because I kind of feel that's what we're doing as translators. And when translating for adults, it's the same thing, that I try to sort of put on this, the skin, that sounds really gruesome, but try to put on the skin of the author or the character, and just try to really get into it and analyze it. I often feel that I am the closest reader an author will ever have, because we have to analyze it and understand it so deeply before we can kind of bring it across.
Oh, thank you for that incredibly vivid metaphor for it, which is wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit about you and putting on the skin or performing without a stage, Sawad, how the translation process works for you in YA and beyond YA?
Yeah, definitely. So I think something which is unique to Arabic YA, but that's because I haven't read, I've read some French YA, but I've only read Arabic and French and English YA. So I mean, anybody in the chat can tell me if this is similar for them, is that translating from YA in Arabic is very much a creative translation process, more so than when I'm translating books for adults, because the YA, Arabic is a diglossic language, right? You've got modern standard Arabic, which is used in like newspapers and novels for adults and university lectures. And then you've got Ammiya, which is this dialect, which is, spoken by people in real life, right? So within families and on, streets and movies and TV shows, etc. And YA up to date, like there is a trend in adult novels to include some dialect, right, in conversations and some of the internal monologue and narrative. But YA up to date is still written in Fusha, which is modern standard Arabic, because books for children are seen as like a sacred ground where the language that you're teaching them must be the Arabic. Like we're not going to teach them, some sort of, lack of a better word, like bastardized Arabic, because Ammiya is influenced depending on which country you're in. So like in Morocco, you've got, influences from French and Spanish, whereas in the Gulf, you've got influences from Urdu, right, due to the historical trading routes with the subcontinent. So when I'm translating this YA book, even like Tufah Djinn, it's written in quite a stilted language. Even so, it reads wonderfully well, right? But the voice that I'm creating in English, I'm really having to make a jump there, which I'm basing on the books that I read, because I love YA in English. So whenever I'm, doing a YA book, I don't have like a 12-year-old girl like roaming around my house. So I'm reading YA books in English, as well as watching films with more, younger narrators, and when they're speaking. And what I would want to say also is that I don't think people realize, like, using, your kids as editors. That's what I did when I was working with Marsha Links-Quayle on Ghadi and Rawan, which is Ghadi and Rawan, which was a Lebanese YA title, which is already available. her children kindly stepped up to be editors for the book, which was, wonderful, because I had given this specific insult. I mean, I taught Key Stage 3 for 10 years, so I feel that really helped me get a hang on language used by that age group. But there was an insult, and he was like, "Mom, people don't use this anymore. Like, this is really outdated." And I was like, that is so great, because an adult editor wouldn't pick up on that. And so I'm thinking, like, even for this book, I'm going to ask her kids to edit it as well, and I'll pay them. But I'm just also going to be and give them acknowledgement if we have some sort of translator's note. But I think people underestimate the wealth of children's knowledge when it comes to the YA literature. Yeah.
That's wonderful. So very much translating with, not for, and being very wary of the sell-by date. Yeah,
I was just going to say that I do exactly the same thing, and I have 2 children, and I read them, especially the older one, my translations, and I know that it's working well when they say things like, "Again, read that again," because then you know that they're really getting it. So it's fantastic. I mean, maybe that's a good piece of advice for people who want to be translators of children's literature. Have children, or find children.
Borrow your neighbors.
Yeah, exactly. Because they're so helpful, and they have no fear telling you that something doesn't sound right or it's not funny.
So we're getting a good appreciation from the listeners here about the idea of kids as editors, which I too very much subscribe to that view. I want to try and get through as many questions as we can now from the audience. And the top voted question is from Katerina Nikita. And she is saying that when working on a sample translation, she's been asked to choose a segment from the book by herself. Any advice on what you'd expect or like to see in the sample selection? How can Katerina choose better?
So I can speak to this, but I think she might want to hear from the publishers first. Yeah.
Well, I guess from my side, it would be look at the genres the publisher is publishing, look at the types of books that they've done in the past, and see if the book that you have in hand fits into that list. Because if it doesn't, then the answer is they're probably not going to be interested. And I think that it depends on the genre. So if it's crime fiction, for example, you're looking at pace, you're looking at, some sort of action scene, I would probably say. If you're looking at literary fiction, something that is beautiful and descriptive and the voice just, comes through. If you're looking at an illustrated a book, just pick something that really, I think as BJ has said, something that connects the text with the illustration. So the publisher can see why it had to be an illustrated book, right? So there's some illustrated books where actually, if you take the illustrations away, you could just have the text by itself and it works. But if you're trying to do it as an, why? So I think you just have to step back. If it's historical fiction, just figure out something a theme that gives that historical hook, so that someone reading that sample will say, "Oh yeah, I get it. I get why, I'd want to do it." So I think it's really figuring out whether the book fits in with the list of the publisher, and then specifically look at the genre of the book that you have in hand and figure out why it's working for you. What are the things that sell for that particular genre, and figuring out the passage that works into that.
And a practical question for you. So I was doing some mentoring recently, and we were working with a rights editor, and they were very concerned that the sample be a straight run through, that it not be selected highlights, because that might give the impression that the sort of lower quality moments in the book have been missed out. So they were wanting to give us a consistent, running through of the first however many chapters. Would your suspicion be raised if you had a bit of a sample from here and a bit of a sample from there?
Yes, because I can't get voice then. So I need, I don't know about you, Greet, but I need to read, chapter 1 or chapter 2 or whatever. So I need a bunch of text where it all flows, because that's voice. So you can get snippets from samples, but yes, I need the longer samples.
So not too much pick and mix.
No.
Any other recommendations in terms of choosing a sample? Any tips from you, Sawad?
Yes, I was going to say, don't be afraid to not do the beginning. I think initially in my career, I always thought the sample had to be the beginning of the book. Having said that, yes, for the Djinn's Apple, it is the beginning of the book. But there was a book I had been shopping around called Passage to the Plaza by Sahar Khalife. And I had originally done the beginning of the book, which actually is very slow. This is not a YA novel. It's a Palestinian resistance novella. And nobody was really picking it up. And I actually was like, okay, maybe let me try something different, because I remember a really long time ago, Antonia Lloyd-Jones had said on this panel at the London Book Fair, the pitch isn't working, go back to it and rework it. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to try that. And so I chose a scene from the climax of the book. And I was like, maybe it's giving too much away, and then it got picked up. Seagull Books picked it up and they were like, they really loved the sample. And it was actually just, a chapter from the end of the book, but it's a part with, as Archna was saying, with like a lot of pace. And it's not like a pacey book per se, but they love that part of it. So I would say choose something that you think is like, a highlight of the book. And it's not necessarily the beginning, because a lot of literary fiction is a slow burn, right? Whereas with the Djinn's Apple, it's easy to do the beginning because it starts with a murder scene. I mean, what more could you want? So yeah.
I'm going to leave us dangling with the murder, because there are some fantastic questions that I want to get in. This is one for you, Greet. In the case of children's books with illustrations, is it essential from the publisher's point of view the original should have excellent illustrations, or would you consider commissioning new ones if the text itself is very good?
I would not commission new illustrations. We need a perfect, and I always use the French word mariage. It just, the text and the illustrations need to blend together perfectly. I know that some publishers do that, but I don't. And also so often we think about the text and the illustrations, but there's also the design of the book. And a lot of European publishers know how to do that. So they'll think about the design before they even start commissioning. And or the graphic designer, the book designer is there first before the illustrator is being commissioned, which results in beautifully crafted books. So that's another aspect of the books that's really important to me.
So you wouldn't want to be unpicking the DNA, it sounds like.
No.
Thank you, Greet. We're going to move on to the phrase prejudging books, which I used. And Ruth is wondering how an emphasis on the translatedness of children's books is perceived by parents and young readers. Do Anglophone readers perceive stories like Little Red Riding Hood and The Ugly Duckling as translated literature? Should they? So what do we think about the emphasis on translatedness of translated children's books, to what extent that's perceived or not by parents and young readers?
I personally think most people aren't aware of it, but I think they should be. So as a parent, when I'm reading books to my children, I always mention who the translator is, what language it's been translated from, and talk about some of those elements, which probably makes me a little bit annoying as a parent, but I think is really important. And yeah. I'm often a little bit surprised when people say, when I ask my students at the university, oh, what translated books have you read? And they think they've read none. They're just so unfamiliar with it. And then you mention things, Pippi Longstocking or Heidi, or yes, the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. Think, oh yeah, I didn't realize it was a translation. I never thought of it as a translation. I think we need to, because that helps us sort of cross borders. We tend to be so insular, I would say, in the UK and in the US. We're always kind of very inward looking. And if we talk about, actually, we have translated this book from this country, and it tells us something about the people there and the way they live, I think it makes people feel less other. And I think it's really important to raise awareness of that, especially in these times.
So raising visibility and lowering the othering. Thank you, BJ. And Sawad, did you want to talk about that at all?
I did, but I think Archna had something to say, so I'll pass it to her. She looked like, yeah.
So I guess from a practical sales perspective, you just want to have the book as just being a great book, right? You don't want to have children or parents go through that hoop to say, this is a translated book. You just want to say, it's a great book, we're going to get it, and not even think about it. But I think that there is great value in people realizing that there is intrinsic value in accessing a text that could only have been written by someone who is living in that particular geography. right? And I think that still needs to be a lot of education about that. And I won't talk specifics, but we went through one particular title that was translated from Spanish by Ben Delatli, and it had a particular title in the Spanish, and in retrospect, we should have changed that title for the English. But I think that if people had gotten past that, they would have really appreciated, and it was one of those illustrated textbooks. You don't know what age it could be. It was very European, beautiful, and it's essentially about climate change and all kinds of stuff. So, but I think that in an ideal world, you want people to seek out translated literature. I certainly do as an adult, but I think from a practical publisher perspective, you just want the book to be sold. You just want it to be, you don't want any extra barriers to be put in. So that's always a bit of, and then the big issue is, do you put the translator's name on the front cover or not? Will that put people off or not? And of course, with Pen, we are going to do that. And for most of my translated books, I have done that. Has that deterred people from buying it? Possibly, possibly, but I don't know. It's a thing. But I think that, so I think it's both. I want to be able to market books as translated books and have people, just buy them because they're translated books. But I think that you just have to do it both ways. I think there are some people who are seeking out translated books and some people who don't care one way or the other.
So Sawad, how do you feel about being both a possible deterrent and the actual money that people are looking for?
I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. I'm sorry.
I'm going to leave you pondering that. We are running fast out of time. I think we've got time for one more question, unless I receive a message from Martin and Anna to the contrary. We do have more questions, but I think we will just close with this last one unless I hear from the contrary. And so this last one is a question for the translators in particular, and it's asking about whether you have to adapt aspects of children's books to take account of taboos and gatekeepers' concerns in English-speaking countries. So Fiona Graham asking the question is particularly thinking of bad language, sex, and death as small topics on which to conclude. And we've had the message in from Anna saying that this is to be the last question. So we are closing on bad language, sex, and death. And to what extent you have to mitigate, alter, gatekeep, shift around these when you're translating for English readers, English-speaking readers.
Sorry to cut you off, just because I'm aware of time and I want to give it to BJ because she's already had a great anecdote about the poo. Super quickly, Arabic literature is already so self-censored. I mean, there's not going to be anything coming through that would not be accepted in the English-speaking world. So I haven't had to encounter that issue because they're already keeping it so sanitized. So that's what I'm going to say.
Thank you. Very clear and helpful, Sawad. And DJ.
Yes. So I gave that one example, but that's not been the only time. However, I would say that I've also had this issue in translating literature for adults. So I won't give all the details about the scene, but there was quite a graphic sex scene that I was translating from a Swedish novel to English. It was just an excerpt that was going to be published in a literary magazine. They really objected to references to the sexual act that was happening, and also to the fact that semen was described. And they said they absolutely couldn't put that in there, and that it would offend British readers. Where I thought, well, British readers, I think, are having sex. And so why is it so shocking to read about it? But the same is true with children's literature. I said before that I believe children have a right to hear about anything. And I think there are age-appropriate ways of doing that. For example, handling death or whatever the topic might be, poo. But you do have to think about your readership, but I would never censor, unless the editor or the publisher tells me that I have to, and that makes me quite annoyed. So unfortunately, it is a problem, especially I would say in the English-speaking countries where we're so prudish.
Oh, thank you, BJ. We're going to have to close there with you as a very reluctant gatekeeper, steering clear of those roles. You have all been extraordinarily generous and insightful in sharing your experiences of translating and publishing and collaborating and making what's available in the English-speaking world have a more international perspective. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. I know that people would like to continue conversations about Greet's stand against Amazon and so forth. So maybe those conversations will continue in other spheres. But for now, that's all we have time for. Wishing everybody who's tuned in today today. An excellent rest of the BCLT Summer School, and we're sorry we can't be with you in person, but it's been a pleasure joining you virtually. And in all my introductions, I don't think I introduced myself at the beginning, so no, my name is Sarah Ardizzone, and I am a translator from the French. And on that note, we're going to close for today. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much
Sarah.
for coming today. Thank you, Sarah.